In 2012, Kickstarter saw two of its earliest and greatest successes, Wasteland 2 and Pillars of Eternity. Both games were pitched as nostalgia-driven throwbacks to an earlier type of RPG in the wake of mass-market games with simplified role-playing mechanics like Skyrim or Mass Effect. Wasteland 2 is a sequel to the predecessor to Fallout and was in part directed at old-school Fallout fans who missed the style of the first two games. Pillars of Eternity was similarly geared towards fans of classic turn-of-the-century fantasy RPGs. To quote its Kickstarter page, it promised to take the central hero, memorable companions, and the epic exploration of Baldur's Gate, add in the fun, intense combat and dungeon diving of Icewind Dale, and tie it all together with the emotional writing and mature thematic exploration of Planescape Torment. Pillars became the most funded game on Kickstarter at the time and was very well received when it came out in 2015. Between it and Wasteland 2, which came out the year before, the CRPG genre was brought back from the dead. The genre enjoyed plenty of niche success in the following years, notably Divinity Original Sin 2 and the immediate classic Disco Elysium, but it was far from a mainstream genre. Then, in 2023, Baldur's Gate 3 came out. I wanted to make a video about how Baldur's Gate 3 is actually overrated and a watered-down casualization of the genre, sacrificing depth for flashy presentation. The problem with that idea is that Baldur's Gate 3 is actually really good. I've played most of the notable revival CRPGs, and Baldur's Gate 3 is the only one I felt inspired to immediately replay after already sinking over 100 hours into my first playthrough. After murdering the entire world and then detoxing by loading up my first character and doing the Patch 5 celebration party, I felt inspired to go back to the game that started it all. Wasteland 2 is okay. It's fun, but it feels pretty basic after you get through the daunting character creation, and the whole first half of the game feels uninspired in the writing department. I'd be comfortable saying it's my least favorite of the revival CRPGs I've played, though it has been a while since I played Tides of Numenera. But what I really felt inspired to revisit, the game I'd actually played before, was Pillars of Eternity. When I first played back in 2017, it quickly entered my all-time favorites list. There are a lot of things, especially in the storytelling and role-playing design, that captivated me, but it's been nearly 10 years since its release, and we've had dozens of games that have had the chance to build upon it, learn from its successes and failures. What is it like to play through now, after Baldur's Gate 3? What does Obsidian do better than Larian, and what did Larian do better? What's it like to play Pillars of Eternity after Baldur's Gate 3? I'm coming into this Pillars playthrough after having already experienced it once, and knowing all the plot and character developments in advance. Well, I did forget about most of Haravius' story arc, but you know what I mean. Me revisiting Pillars won't be the same as someone who has never played before coming in after experiencing Baldur's. This is significant because the game starts kind of slow, a far cry from the action of Baldur's, and someone without prior investment might not be grabbed. In BG3, you get a flashy CGI cutscene with bombastic music and an exciting chase scene between tentacle aliens and dragons that takes a quick detour through hell. After character creation, you make your way through the crumbling ship, fighting to the controls so you can warp out of hell, and once you do, the ship crashes. Exciting. In Pillars, you have a tummy ache while traveling with a migrant caravan, and you go off into the woods to find some soothing berries. Then the caravan gets attacked because you're too close to some ruins, so there is still some action. Then you flee into those ruins and notice some weird cultists turn on a weird machine, and you get hit with a soulstorm that is described largely with voiced text rather than a fancy cutscene. Other reviews of Pillars mention its slow start and dense assault of jargon it begins with. I find this somewhat exaggerated, as everything is understandable enough with context. Who are the Ingwithans? Oh, they're this setting's mysterious precursors. What's a Biowak? A bad storm. But remember, I have played this game and its sequel before, so perhaps my familiarity with the setting has spoiled my ability to truly feel overwhelmed like a newcomer might. It absolutely would have been better if it had used rollover text to define lore terms. Unfortunately, Obsidian would not introduce this innovation until a year later in Tyranny, so we'll have to go without it. But it is impossible to deny that Pillars has a slower start. After the Soul Storm that closes out the tutorial and incites the rest of the plot, there are no major set-piece moments until the end of Act 2, unless you jump into the White March DLC. This game is fairly subdued and forlorn in tone. The equivalent to the Druid's Grove in Baldur's Gate is the town of Gilded Vale. They really aren't that similar, but they're both the first major post-tutorial settlements you'll most likely go to. In Baldur's, you'll find the Druid's Grove besieged by goblins, and you'll have an exciting companion introduction when Will Errol Flynn's his way onto the scene, which gets you into the Tiefling refugee plot with a bang. In Pillars, you wander into Gilded Vale and see that things suck here quite a lot. So many people are hanging from this tree. And one of the two Matthew Mercer-voiced companions you recruit in this village is just there, hanging out sadly until he sees you talk to a dead person. The other Matthew Mercer companion is about to get into a bar fight. It's all more mundane, not very exciting. I think this is fine, it fits what the game is going for, but combined with the presentation style, it's obviously not going to grab everyone. I'd say the same regarding the stakes of the main quests. In both games, you gradually build up a party of misfits as you learn about a ticking clock affecting you. In Baldur's, you have a Mind Flayer tadpole in your head that will transform you into an illithid, while in Pillars, your newfound ability to peer into your own past life will drive you insane. But it takes far longer for Pillars to set up those stakes. In Baldur's, Lae'zel makes sure you're aware of the tadpole a third of the way through the tutorial. In Pillars, you learn about your eventual loss of sanity by speaking to the similarly afflicted Mayorwald, and if you drag your feet finding him, it could be over 10 hours before you get your character's external motivation for the plot. I find this a bit of a mixed bag in both cases. The urgency of the tadpole is pushed so hard in Baldur's that it might seem like the game is telling you to rest as little as possible and prioritize the main quest.
Do you suppose the parasites inside us dare to rest? That the Geich do not still pursue us with each peal of the bell?
However, you actually should rest often so you don't miss out on companion scenes. It's not until your first dream visit, several rests into the game, that you'll get somewhat of an in-character excuse not to rush. So I mostly prefer how Pillars structures things. The main quest is an investigation driven by the player as you track down the people who caused the Soulstorm and uncover more about the conspiracy they enforce. There's no definitive timeline given for when the player is doomed to succumb to the same madness as Mayorwald, and there's never really a clear ticking clock presented until a few people vaguely say in Act 3, "Oh no, we have to follow the villain into his lair soon, who knows what he's up to." This allows for a more free-flowing approach where there's rarely an awkward moment where the immersion breaks because it's obvious that the plot is waiting for the player. But again, it does mean that there is less extrinsic momentum to getting through the whole game. I want to briefly compare how second playthroughs feel. Experiencing Pillars after knowing what's going to happen means realizing just how tightly written the game really is, with layered foreshadowing and thematic seeds all over the place. When exploring Gilded Vale, I appreciated seeing early perspectives on the Hollowborn, the Saints' War, and the Gods, knowing where all these threads were going. In contrast, the beginning of Baldur's Gate 3 makes little sense when you come back around to it. It feels like this cutscene was written super early in development, and then they went to all the trouble of animating it, and then they couldn't change it when the story ended up going in a different direction. So during this cutscene, the Nautiloid ship goes to some random town to abduct people. Despite what you may assume, it's most likely not the city of Baldur's Gate, because when you get there in Act 3, the citizens never mention the raid, but what is Astarion doing in this other random town to get abducted?
I was in Baldur's Gate when those beasts snatched me.
Then, the Nautiloid gets chased into Avernus by Githyanki, where it picks up Will and Karlach, somehow. While it's being chased through the sky, Karlach finds her way onto it, and Will follows her because I guess both could fly. And the Mind Flayers inside figure that now's a perfect time to tadpole more people, so they take a break from their emergency battle stations to do so. And why is the Nautiloid even performing this raid on the town in the first place? A lot of the details we later learn about what the Nautiloid was doing and who was commanding it makes me question what's being shown here. At the end of the day, this isn't a big deal for Baldur's Gate. It's a minor inconsistency with a pre-rendered scene that happens before we really start playing. I'm only bringing it up to say that it's a little easier to see the seams on your second playthrough of Baldur's, at least in some areas. while Pillars is probably much better the second time around because you can see how well things were set up in scenes you may have been bored by the first time. Pillars gradually introduces us to the major elements of the setting that will be explored throughout the game: the gods, the Hollowborn crisis, and the Saints' War. Each of these, in turn, are the sources of the game's capital T themes, those being what it means to have faith, the nature of secrets and uncovering truth, and the impact of the past on the present. These are huge ideas, aided by the setting being perfectly tailored to exploring them. And the moment you begin learning about the lore, you're also starting to consider the themes. The writing is so cohesive in a way that's rare for huge, multi-hour RPGs. But an approach like this can feel very dry. Even if there was sleek cutscene presentation like Baldur's, it would still feel that way. Pillars of Eternity is a very cerebral story in the sense that it's more about ideas than emotional moments and in-depth character relationships. The relationships are there, don't get me wrong, and I'm definitely not saying that if you bounce off Pillars that means you're too dumb for it. Pillars just doesn't hook you the same way Baldur's does. It lays its introduction out and invites you to engage with it and explore deeper, somewhat assuming that its extensive Kickstarter audience will want to. It may perhaps be too presumptive for someone coming in fresh roughly a decade later after experiencing Baldur's Gate. But it still has the magic for me. Pillars of Eternity takes place in the fantasy setting of Eora. It is, in some ways, the embodiment of the ethos the game was designed under. It's a mix of brand new, unique ideas alongside elements that are very familiar. This is clear as early as character creation when you see the list of playable species with the standard humans, dwarves, and elves of Tolkien-esque Dungeons & Dragons stock fantasy, but also the Aumaua, the Orlans, and the godlike. The game's treatment of the familiar species is also not quite standard. The dwarf companion Sagani comes from an Inuit-inspired tribe rather than an underground mining kingdom with Nordic names like most fantasy dwarves. The only group of elves given much specific exploration as their own culture distinct from humans is the Snow Elves in an Act 3 side quest. Other elves seem to just be part of multi-ethnic cultures like the Aediran Empire. The level of societal development is another twist on the familiar. Technology is roughly analogous to how it was in our 17th or 18th century, with guns aplenty and cannon-wielding forts and ships. However, a broad suite of melee weapons is still in common use alongside various forms of magic. Guns are spoken about as great equalizers against mages, but they are far from the dominant mode of combat. Much of the history of the Dyrwood, the part of the game the world is set in, takes cues from American colonial history with its war for independence against an imperial power and conflicts with the indigenous population. Yet aesthetically, much of the game still feels generically medieval as you explore castles, towns, and villages. There's more focus given to the Aumaua societies or the nature of the godlike than to elves or dwarves, and the sequel is all about the Aumaua. There's a bit of a sense of obligation in the inclusion of more familiar elements, while there is palpable imagination and excitement in the original ideas. In recent years, game director Josh Sawyer called this game the most compromised project he ever worked on because he felt like his desires to innovate the RPG genre were stifled a bit by the Kickstarter demands of appealing to nostalgia for Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. This could certainly explain these obligatory inclusions, but I very much appreciate the effort taken to spin these ideas as much as possible. Baldur's Gate 3, like its predecessors, takes place in the Forgotten Realms setting of Dungeons & Dragons, a kitchen sink backdrop meant to facilitate private tabletop games rather than coherently explore specific themes. Faerun carries some of the most stock archetypal fantasy setting tropes. However, as a kitchen sink setting, there is also a lot of more unique stuff. And to Larian Studios' credit, they chose to construct their story around a lot of it. Stock fantasy does not usually include a race of genetically engineered psychic frog knights who ride dragons in the outer space dimension, but the Githyanki are a prominent part of Baldur's Gate 3. The focus on Githyanki and tieflings in Act 1 gives a much more unique feel to the otherwise very cliché arc of goblins are causing trouble on behalf of a greater evil. There are benefits and drawbacks to working in a pre-made setting like this. You can find something interesting in the existing tropes at play, but you can also end up constrained. In contrast, crafting a setting around one story's themes can limit your ability to find new ground to explore in a sequel. Pillars 2 is a little less tight than the first in this regard, and we'll see how Avowed turns out. For Baldur's Gate 3, existing Forgotten Realms lore is pulled together to combine a bunch of cool stuff into its narrative while inventing some of the more local elements. The peak of the game, the shadow-cursed land of Act 2, is wholly invented by Larian, and the history of the place and the individuals who shaped it is compelling and focused. Most of the incorporated D&D lore serves the repeating story element of powerful godlike entity is abusive towards one of the protagonists who fights for their freedom. The gods are, naturally, existing characters from Forgotten Realms, while new higher power characters serve as instances of an existing type, like Raphael, the Cambion Devil. There is one particular incorporation of existing lore that I very much do not like, and well, I think I need to go in-depth on spoilers for the rest of this video, so here's your warning. You should skip to the conclusion, at least. I think there's a pretty important spoiler-free thing I have to say there. Anyway, it turns out that Balduran, the legendary founder of the city of Baldur's Gate from centuries ago, is still alive, and has become your shady Mind Flayer protector friend, the Emperor. It's a bizarre choice. It radically alters a major lore character in a way that could be easily missed since the reveal is only in a side quest. It feels like an attempt to impose greater weight onto the Emperor that he hasn't earned but also never needed. The backstory he gives at the start of Act 3, featuring him as just a nameless adventurer, is great as it is, and this later revealed secret identity conceptually bloats him. So here we see the game slamming face first into one of the pitfalls of writing within an existing setting. Fans of the previous Baldur's Gates, which Larian Studios did not design, remember, have also expressed disappointment with how the returns of Viconia and Saravak are handled, completely walking back any potential character development they can achieve in Baldur's 2. Baldur's Gate 3 and Pillars of Eternity demonstrate different ways to make the familiar feel more original when you have to include something more cliché. Pillars of Eternity invents a cohesive, unique setting with some deceptively conventional aesthetics. Baldur's Gate 3 focuses on somewhat less conventional elements of a highly archetypal overall setting. Larian did a good job, but I personally hold more admiration for the from-scratch world-building work that Obsidian did. There's one more element of the lore I'd like to discuss: the gods. I'll limit my discussion of the Forgotten Realms pantheon to those depicted in Baldur's Gate 3 because I don't know much more beyond that. We have Selûne, the goddess of the moon and associated with light, Lathander, god of the sun and also associated with light, Sylvanas, god of nature, Mystra, goddess of magic, and Shar, goddess of darkness and loss. Oh yeah, and the Dead Three: Baal, the god of murder, Myrkul, the god of the dead, and Bane, god of tyranny. As they're depicted in this game, only Shar demonstrates real philosophical bent to her domain. The others are focused on their core aspects. Baal likes wanton killing, Myrkul likes bones, Selûne makes light, and Mystra likes telling her ex to blow himself up. Shar, however, is explored in an interesting way, with Shadowheart justifying her faith by explaining the comforting way she views loss. Later, through Ketheric, we can see ways in which Shar's comfort fails. Pillars of Eternity also has a goddess of loss. Her name is Andra, also the goddess of the sea and the moon. The White March expansions are, in part, dedicated to exploring her domain and philosophy. If you have high intellect, you can even have a Reddit debate with her about the merits of her beliefs.
I put it to you.
No, I put it to you.
I put it to you.
Not only do I put it to
I put it back to you.
I wish there were more options to choose from in this debate that isn't "but suffering builds character." Other conversations in the game are much better about this. But it is funny and cool that you can have it in the first place. Andra is the norm among her peers rather than the exception like Shar. All the gods of Eora combine the physical with the philosophical. The goddess Hylia is goddess of the sky, motherhood, and also, of all things, art and creativity. Magran is not just goddess of fire, but the goddess of war and challenges. The gods exist to represent values and concepts. And much like the example of Sagani being an Inuit dwarf instead of a Nordic one, the way these concepts intermingle with their physical aspects can be unexpected but still sensible. Many world builders wouldn't have combined sky, birds, motherhood, and art, but with Hylia it feels right. The god of cold, Remergand, is also the god of entropy, of final death in a world with reincarnation. Cold and entropy and finality fit so well together, but it's a conceptual connection I don't see often. The Eoran pantheon is one of my favorites in fiction. though a large part of that has to do with their usage in the story, which we will get to. A lot of fantasy stories, especially video games, directly involve the gods of their settings, and I honestly felt annoyed when they started directly interfering in Baldur's Gate 3. It lessens the impact of more direct villains like Ketheric Thorm, who is only involving himself in the plot because his god told him he had to be there. But for Pillars of Eternity, I don't feel this annoyance. The narrative is built around a purposeful exploration of this pantheon, while in Baldur's Gate, some of them are up to no good, and some of them are helping you out. Pillars of Eternity has one of the best role-playing mechanics I've seen, but it's entirely possible to play the game and not even know about it. In the difficulty options, you can check a box that tells you how a dialogue choice will influence your reputations. If you turn it on, you're basically metagaming, influencing the choices you may make by telling you in advance what some of the results will be. If you turn it off, though, you may go through the entire game completely ignorant of what the reputation mechanics even are. So, what are they? Pillars uses a faction reputation system much like Fallout New Vegas, where things a faction likes will improve the player's reputation with them, and acting against them will diminish it. The Pillars version also has the disposition element. Dialogue options are often flagged with one of 10 possible personality types, or dispositions. These types are aggressive, benevolent, clever, cruel, deceptive, diplomatic, honest, passionate, rational, and stoic. Responding with silence or lack of emotion will typically be stoic. Any outburst with an exclamation point is probably passionate. Any attempts to calmly negotiate a compromise in a situation or be polite to powerful people will be diplomatic. You get the idea. Classifying options along these personality types rather than the good option and the evil option expands potential role-playing opportunities considerably, and as you choose enough of the same type, your reputation for that type will build and characters will react accordingly. Someone begging for your help might say, "I know you're a good person, please help me," if you have a reputation for being benevolent. If you're honest, people might say, "I know you're honest, so I trust you." If you're cruel, people might be afraid of you. There are also several instances in which having specific reputations unlocks dialogue options for you. The first Pillars game doesn't have very many skill checks, partly because it doesn't have very many skills, and so the dialogue checks tend to be either attribute-based or disposition-based. Having sufficient honesty values can unlock some persuasion options because, people think you're trustworthy. But as I said, if you don't have the notifications in the difficulty settings enabled, you might never notice just how reactive this game is. When a character you're talking to says a disposition-specific line, this setting gives you a little note in brackets indicating that the reason they're saying it is because of a disposition rating. If you have the notifications off, you just see the line, and it might seem like something the NPC would always say. So, do you turn on these notifications to appreciate how much your character building matters, but have a less organic playthrough where your options may be chosen more based on disposition than what they actually say? Or do you go in quote-unquote pure and pay more attention to what you're saying, but risk feeling less like your choices matter? One thing I noticed while playing around with this feature is that having the notifications on can help encourage stricter role-playing as a particular character or type, whereas having them off can lead to a more variable react-as-yourself kind of approach. As mentioned, this game doesn't have many skill checks in dialogue like other RPGs. The lore skill appears most often, with athletics and survival showing up frequently as well. But most of the time, dialogue checks are based on core attributes, which you don't get to permanently increase through leveling up, but you can boost temporarily with resting bonuses, equipment, and food. Quick tip, if you want to persuade people, resolve is usually the attribute being checked. This part of the role-playing system doesn't do it for me as much as skill check-based dialogues, but it's something I got used to. The disposition system is what really shines, and is what I want to call out as a fantastic role-playing mechanic that needs to show up more often. Baldur's Gate 3 is more standard. Dialogue reactivity is in the moment, coming from specific actions you may have already taken. For instance, an NPC won't react differently if you're known as a generally mean person, but they will remember you saying or doing a mean thing to them specifically. Ketheric Thorm will never say, "Ah, you have a reputation for cruelty, so I know you'd fit right in with my army," but he will say, "Hey man, what the hell, why did you kill my daughter when I asked you to bring her in alive if you do that? You monster." So while the dialogue system is good, it does feel like the options presented are less expansive than in Pillars. That said, you do frequently get unique lines if you're a specific origin character. The Dark Urge gets many chances to talk about their, dark urge that other characters won't get. And I shouldn't overhype the Pillars dialogue options. You pretty much never get choices for all possible dispositions in a single response, you usually only get a few at a time. Speaking of origin characters, the ability to play as party members is something of a Larian trademark by now, having appeared in Baldur's as well as Divinity Original Sin 2. I would assume other Divinity games do it, but I haven't played those and don't feel like binging them. I personally don't care for this feature very much, as I prefer custom characters in this kind of RPG, but it's cool that it's there. You can get a slightly different experience through the eyes of one of these predefined characters, and it's something no other RPG developer does that I'm aware of. Of course, Baldur's Gate 3 has skill checks galore, sleight of hand, arcana, deception, what have you. There are attribute checks as well, but skills are way more common. Occasionally you get class or background-based dialogue options, and the game clearly tells you when it happens. By default, you are very aware of how your character building choices are influencing how dialogue is going. Considering the whole breadth of the RPGs I've played, Baldur's Gate 3 has a good dialogue system. Definitely leagues better than the dialogue wheels of BioWare games, or impersonal third-person choices from Divinity Original Sin 2, or generic topic-based choices like in Wasteland 2. But I still think the Pillars disposition system is super cool. Like I said, I wish it was iterated on more. I'll restate that when it comes to narrative, Pillars of Eternity is more cerebral, idea-focused, and complex, but also drier and less emotionally gripping, while Baldur's Gate 3 is more exciting, engaging, and character-driven, but also dumber and shallower. This very much applies to the companions, the casts of misfits who follow you around on your journeys while gradually spilling the beans about their deepest, darkest secrets. The companions of Baldur's Gate 3 are perhaps the biggest draws to this game. Would it be the smash hit it was if not for the sheer assault of personality coming from these weirdos?
This group is full of weirdos!
They're extremely fun to be around thanks to the writing, the performances, and the animation work. There's life to these characters that simply doesn't exist in most games. I would argue that perhaps Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous approaches a similar achievement without the benefit of animation and full voice acting, but Pillars of Eternity does not. That said, setting aside the emotional experience of traveling with the Baldur's party, which is valuable, don't get me wrong, there isn't as much to think about and pick at as the Pillars of Eternity cast. Baldur's Gate 3 has 6 main companions, the origin characters you recruit right away, and 4 additional companions you pick up along the adventure who have less overall development. Halsin, Minthara, Jaheira, and Minsk feel almost like the sidekicks that the Pillars sequel would introduce, in that they are companions with less substantial roles in the overall experience and less writing. The other 6, Astarion, Gale, Karlach, Shadowheart, Lae'zel, and Will make up the core party, so to speak. And they kind of all have the same story, struggling for independence and self-worth against a much more powerful master figure. Astarion has escaped from and is plotting revenge against Cazador. Gale is dealing with his breakup with the goddess Mystra. Karlach is on the run from a powerful demon from Avernus who had enslaved her. Will is in service to one of that demon's lesser demons as his pact giver. Shadowheart struggles with her indoctrinated allegiance to Shar, and Lae'zel struggles with her indoctrinated allegiance to Vlaakith. Their personalities are distinct, but their actual plot lines all kind of feel like the same basic thing, with the greatest variation coming from Gale, whose relationship with his more powerful entity is also the least dramatized. Maybe there's more if you play him as an origin character, I don't know. By contrast, Pillars of Eternity has a much more varied and conceptually interesting cast of companions, but with less overall voice acting and shorter quest lines, they aren't explored as much and don't feel as fleshed out as people. In spite of that shortcoming, I like them a lot for the way their plotlines serve as diverse explorations of the various themes of the game. Eder, Durance, Heravius, and Pallegina all express different approaches to faith in a world where gods not only provably exist, but one of them, Eothas, outright died 15 years ago. Eder worshipped that god, only to disagree with the actions Eothas took in his mortal incarnation, and now struggles with reconciling his faith with his morals. Durance helped kill that god, only to be ignored by his own and fell into more barbaric acts of piety to try to get her to notice him again. Heravius is a convert. He began worshipping the god Galawain only to turn to the god Whale in search of answering the mystery of his druidic shapeshift form. In other words, he turned to one god to answer a mystery presented by another. Pelagina is a godlike, a member of a sapient species that has been marked by one of the gods, but she has faced nothing but grief for this accident of birth and has become strongly anti-deistic as a result. Then there are the companions who relate more to the nature of souls in this world and the influence of the past. Aloth suffers from a past life's personality flaring up every now and then and causing trouble whenever he feels distressed or powerless, embodying the past's unwanted intrusion on the present in a way that can both benefit and harm. Sagani's storyline revolves around her tribe's tradition of seeking out their tribal leaders' reincarnations to inform them of the state the village has been in since they died. It explores how confirmed reincarnation could reasonably affect cultural practices. Maneha is plagued by memories of atrocities that her past life committed and seeks to wipe her memories of that life with Andra's help. And you guide her either to live with these past atrocities in the hopes of tempering her future acts, or to unburden herself of sins that really are not her own. Then there's the Devil of Karok, a living experiment, a soul trapped in an automated body in a way that clarifies how souls even work. And there's Zawa, who must choose whether to cling to the hope of rescuing his conquered, forcefully assimilated people or carry on his traditions to new practitioners. Kanarua's quest involves the discovery of academic assumptions about the past being wrong and incomplete, and grappling with the value of that. And then there's Grieving Mother. I really love Grieving Mother. The concept behind her is so cool. She is an exceptionally powerful psychic, never formally trained, who lived as a midwife helping a village bring children into the world with the help of her powers. But then the Hollowborn crisis happened. Infants born without souls. What is the impact of this crisis, the main source of conflict in the game, on one whose life revolves around childbirth? The Grieving Mother used her powers to trick mothers of Hollowborn into thinking their catatonic children were healthy, thinking it was the best option, only for a mother to die neglecting herself for her brain-dead child, and then the spell over everyone was broken. The Grieving Mother was driven out of town and, out of guilt, suppressed her own memories of the deed. When you find her, she has been living with a perception filter around herself, a call, she says, making her practically invisible to everyone else in the world. It is only because of the player character's Watcher abilities that you can even see her. She even has an NPC name, Grieving Mother, instead of a full name like any other significant character. No one else in the party registers that she's there, fighting alongside them. During Adair's quest, she can volunteer to help with something, only for Adair to say, "Hey, thanks random stranger, but unless you happen to be a psychic, I don't know what you can do."
Pardon me, madam. I didn't see you there. My whole right side is sort of a blind spot.
No need to trouble yourself.
Well, I was wondering how long you've been... Oh, forget it. Probably no big deal.
At the very end of the game, when you confront the main villain, he gives every one of the companions you bring with you a verbal assault to try to break their spirits, but he can't notice Grieving Mother. She's one of the most unique RPG companions ever, and as a cipher, she has highly spammable charm and paralysis attacks which are invaluable crowd control. I'm also a sucker for the strange, cryptic, metaphorical language that her conversations with you take, though many can't stand her for this, and I get it. All this is to say that the Pillars party feels like you are continuing to explore the world and the themes of the story through these conceptually interesting people. They also bring nuance to the themes when their stories are similar but different. When you finally unravel what happened with Grieving Mother, she asks you to help her erase her memories of her mistakes permanently, with no chance that they could be salvaged once again. Placed next to Maneha, there is a more complicated picture of what it means for an individual to feel the effects of the past. Maybe you agree with the goddess Andra and think that all painful memories are obstacles and should be forgotten. Maybe you think that both of these companions should remember past pain to help keep them from causing more. Maybe you think that Grieving Mother should remember and deal with her own actions, while Maneha should not have to bear a burden that is not really hers, so you keep Grieving Mother's memories but wipe Maneha's. Or maybe you want to wipe Grieving Mother's memories but keep Maneha's because, well, I find this choice harder to justify. Maybe you think that Maneha can handle those memories, but Grieving Mother can't. The point is that Grieving Mother and Maneha's storylines complement and complicate each other, expanding the question, is it better to remember or forget misdeeds of the past rather than just asking it twice? I can't say the same for Baldur's Gate 3, where I can't imagine a reason for a player encouraging Shadowheart to reject Shar while encouraging Lae'zel to stay loyal to Vlaakith for any reason beyond just because. Maybe in character you want to have Vlaakith's empire at your side but don't care about Shar? But that's not a thematic position to take. I want to talk a little more about my other favorite companion characters, Adair and Pallegina, because I think they're neat. Adair is sort of a himbo type, especially when it comes to wanting to pet Sagani's wolf, or being accidentally racist to Heravius.
I warned you not to pet him.
If I'm not supposed to pet him, why is he so soft?
But his storyline shows a much more thoughtful, introspective side to him, as he grapples with his brother's choice to help Widewind/Aothis' crusade and what it means to worship a dead god whose actions you've come to condemn. He may decide that he wants to do good based on his own morals. Adair ends up being the most multidimensional member of the cast despite his seemingly simple demeanor and straightforward fighter class. Then there's Pallegina, who I really like in this game but find less endearing in the sequel for frustratingly in-character reasons. I mentioned her nature as a godlike, and her resulting rejection of theistic worship is core to her. She's extremely loyal to her country, the Vailian Republics, but is capable of thinking for herself and is, in this first game, willing to disobey direct orders to exploit the Dyrwood's current turmoil in the short term out of the belief that in the long term, it would be better to keep the Republics and the Dyrwood on good terms. Her side quest fits under the Reactions to the Hollowborn Crisis category of companion stories, representing the international response to the Dyrwood's local troubles. Part of what I love about her is her strong moral heart when it comes to the downtrodden and outcast, thanks to her experiences as a godlike.
From the Vailian Republics to Erglan Thoth, narrowness of mind is truly universal.
Even though sometimes she suppresses it out of nationalistic interest. In Pillars 2, the interests of the Vailian Republics are more central, which means she exhibits far more of this nationalism at the expense of many of her more endearing traits. But one thing that always comes through with her is her hatred of the gods, and when she finds out about their true nature, she responds immediately with perfect anti-nihilism.
Verus, we find purpose in ourselves and in the people in our lives.
The companions aren't perfect, of course. The main flaw that prevents them from achieving Baldur's Gate 3 levels of emotional attachment is that interacting with them can be static. You can exhaust all of the getting to know you questions as soon as you meet them, and if there are ever any follow-up responses to what they say, you rarely get more than one option. Talking with them is linear in a way other dialogues aren't. And they don't have many unique lines to respond to events that have just happened after they give their in-the-moment interjections. In Baldur's Gate 3, companions do regularly have unique greeting lines at the start of conversations based on the latest plot development.
I can't help feeling Will got off lightly. The wrath of the hells is second only to the wrath of the heavens.
Even though you almost never have anything to talk with them about at camp beyond their personal quests, these greeting lines are extensive. There's almost a trade-off trick happening. In Pillars, the companions will say a lot to you right away about themselves, their cultures, and their backstories, but they rarely get new things to say over the course of your journey. In Baldur's, you exhaust available talking points with them super quickly, and then get drip-fed new topics or lines as things progress. The Baldur's approach feels more organic, gives more of a sense of growth, and makes companions feel more reactive. It's also far from unique to Baldur's. Returning to the Normandy in Mass Effect and running around to see if anyone has anything new to say is a time-honored post-mission tradition. Its comparative lack in Pillars of Eternity 1 has the mentioned side effect of making the party feel like they have less character development, which is unfortunate. A criticism I have for both games is that companion banter triggers far too infrequently. So many interactions between them are conveyed this way, but in both games the triggers for such interactions can be so specific and unreliable that they feel rare. There are a lot of ways in which Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous has my favorite RPG party, but one of them, which is also present in Kingmaker, but I happen to like the Wrath party more, is putting these banters in nearly every rest your party takes. You have to rest a lot in the Pathfinder game, so these exchanges happen often and can be triggered reliably. I have a clearer sense of how several party members in this game feel about each other than I do in Pillars or Baldur's.
Vagrant, you sleep on the street, wear rags, and all of your friends are beggars. There's dirt and disease all around you. You belong in an infirmary.
Thank you, Camellia. You're so caring.
But I don't want to start going in-depth into a third sprawling fantasy CRPG, so I'll leave it at this. I wish both games triggered companion banter more often. Lastly, I'd like to discuss romances. Baldur's has them, Pillars 1 does not. I don't think one approach is necessarily better than the other, though I will say that not worrying about romance options can free the game developers up to include grosser companions. Durance is ugly, bigoted, and covered in pox scars. No one would expect anyone to kiss him. I wonder if the inclusion of companion romances led to the loose homogeneity of the Baldur's party. I mean, including the 4 tag-alongs, we have a tiefling, a Githyanki, 5 flavors of elf, and 3 humans. There are no dragonborn, dwarf, or halfling companions, and thinking back to other fantasy RPGs, I don't think that short king companions, when they exist, are ever romanceable. So I just looked it up, and Divinity Original Sin 2 apparently does let you romance the dwarf pirate Beast. Fans generally consider him the worst written companion, and when I played, he died, because the game locks you into a party at the end of Act 1 and kills off any possible companions not with you. Which is a decision I'm so glad Larian did not repeat for Baldur's, but what was I on about? Oh yeah, he's the one romanceable dwarf in video games that I'm aware of. Maybe Larian didn't include dwarf or halfling companions because they didn't think people would want to romance them. They were probably right. But if every companion is romanceable except the 2 returning ones from BioWare's old Baldur's Gate games, then the companions will be designed to be attractive. Even Gale. And that consideration likely does influence how varied in appearance the companions can be. But maybe it doesn't. Just a thought. I don't have too much to say about the gameplay comparison because Baldur's Gate 3 is just better, unambiguously. It feels more responsive, more visceral, and more expressive. Some of this is down to fancier graphics and presentation, some of it is due to the turn-based system making things easier to keep track of than real-time with pause and pillars, but one of the big things is environmental reactivity. You get more of an opportunity to be creative in Baldur's, to use tools in ways well outside their obvious purpose. To illustrate my point, I'll compare the difference between my proudest in-combat moments in each game. In Pillars of Eternity, I gave Pallegina the special greatsword St. Edwin's Redeemer. It is a soulbound weapon, which in this game means you bind it to a specific character and complete certain challenges with them to improve its stats and abilities. When St. Edwin's Redeemer is fully improved, each strike has a 25% chance to immediately destroy any vessel-type enemy. So at the end of the Siege of Cragholt side quest, you have a challenging boss fight against the Lich Consulhot, and Liches are vessels. So as soon as combat started, I sent Pallegina forward and she deleted this high-level boss in one hit. It was great. It was a result of the game systems working together as intended with the help of some lucky dice rolls. In Baldur's Gate 3, I was having trouble defeating Shar's followers at the end of Shadowheart's storyline. There are a lot of cultists in that room. But then I remembered that I never used the rune powder bomb I was given to deal with the Steel Watch. I blew up their factory another way. So on my next try, I had Karlach hurl the bomb into the middle of the room, then dropped a globe of invulnerability around my party and lit the fireworks. There were some survivors, but not for long, and luckily the wooden door was enough to protect Philosophy Tube, so there was no collateral damage. The moment I described in Pillars is common in most RPGs of this type. You use a powerful tool in a way it's intended, and Lady Luck may or may not smile on you, or you may find powerful stat combinations in advance. What I described in Baldur's Gate 3 is in-the-moment ingenuity, using a tool in an unexpected way that is easily reproducible. Larian's interactive sandbox design is great, and a reason why the praise for their games is well-deserved. Less interactive systems may be satisfying in their own way, and some may prefer the pure stat-based approach, but I think it's safe to say that the majority would find Larian's style more fun. Something I appreciate in both games is that bosses can still be affected by debuffs. You can defeat Raphael by using Hold Monster and Baldur's. You can paralyze the Adra Dragon in Pillars. Some may be immune to some things, but no enemy is immune to everything. It's not an uncommon aspect of game design, but it's always nice when it's there. If you've played the Pathfinder games and haven't painstakingly over-optimized your character, then you'll probably know the pain of having a boss shrugging off all your spells. Aside from that, I don't feel motivated to go into depth about more gameplay differences. That may be unfair to Baldur's Gate because I'm focusing on things it's not as clearly dominant at, but I've seen a lot of videos about RPGs that neglect the storytelling of Pillars, so... Alright class, what was the narrative dichotomy? That's right. Pillars of Eternity has a thoughtful, theme-rich story with a fairly simple and slow-paced plot, while Baldur's Gate 3 has an exciting and dynamic story that doesn't seem to have that much to say beneath the surface. It does have some themes, but, well, let's talk about Pillars first. I've mentioned the main themes of Pillars a couple times already. The fluctuations and nuances of faith and religious conviction, the ways the past continues to influence the present, and the turmoil of uncovering guarded secrets. These distinct themes are explored separately and intertwined together. Eora is a world in which people reincarnate, and sometimes they remember their past lives in what is called an awakening. Is Pillars of Eternity woke? The way past lives bleed into the Awakened leaves them with many problems, explored through Aloth, Maneha, and the player, but also Meerwald, who, like the player, is simultaneously awakened and a watcher, which drives him insane as his past lives surge up. Things are especially bad for Meerwald because one of his past lives was a Glanfathan raider who was killed in a particularly violent attack on Aediran colonists, and immediately reincarnated into an Aediran child who was, shall we say, conceived violently during that raid. This incarnation was raised to hate Glanfathans and ended up committing war crimes against them. When both of these past lives of the same soul flared up within Meerwald, things went quite badly. Meerwald's madness is symbolic of the deep bloodstains that past atrocity can leave behind in ways that are still visible in the present. It makes literal and tangible things that in real life have more invisible, systemic manifestations. The past actions of the Aedirans and Glanfathans still influence the relationship between the Glanfathans and the now independent Dyrwood. Distrust and tension continues after years of bloodshed. No matter what Andra may think, the past happened, and forgetting it after reincarnating doesn't erase its effects. The Engwithans were here, their ruins still dot the map, as do their creations. The game's exploration of faith is perhaps its most pronounced. Even before the gods become directly involved in Act 3, or in White March Part 2, they are invoked constantly, and we frequently see worshippers with different approaches to the same god. Durance is aggressive, rude, and confrontational with his worship of Magran and her challenging flames. He sees every challenge as worthwhile. But Firga, leader of Magran's faithful in the city of Defiance Bay, suffers a crisis of faith because the Hollowborn seem like challenge without purpose. Does suffering alone make a challenge worthwhile? Is there always a lesson in it? Durance seems to think so. You may have to say so if you want to rekindle Firga's faith. Faith can inspire good and evil. Eder has always tried to live true to Eothas' ideals of renewal, even though he disapproves of what the god himself did through Widewin. Andra's followers can indeed soothe the burdens of people who are suffering from traumas. Despite Magran's ruthlessness, she serves as inspiration for the independent spirit of the Dyrwood. Hiravius takes comfort in whichever god he chooses at the end of his quest. But the Skaenites would fight injustice by brainwashing a victim to murder her entire family. Anti-Eothas purges committed by people like Durance targeted many innocents like the Devil of Carrick. I mean, she's a murderer now, but that happened after the purges. And the main villain of the game, Theos Ix Arcanon, led brutal inquisitions in the past and leads a murderous conspiracy now in the name of the gods. And as for secrets, well, the whole game is a quest for truth. Theos' conspiracy, the Leaden Key, exists to keep certain secrets hidden forever. The main plot is an investigation into who the Leaden Key are and what exactly they are trying to keep hidden. In the process, you are entangled in debates around the science of animancy, research into the exact functionality of souls and the manipulation thereof. These experiments often go awry. In fact, nearly every one of them you encounter in the game has disastrous consequences. You're asked to consider whether the price of knowledge of the world is worth it, or if the universe should keep some secrets. But it turns out that many of these disasters are actually caused by the Leaden Key trying to make animancy seem worse than it is. You participate in hearings on the future of animancy in the Deerwood, where you can urge those present to ban the practice, give it oversight, or let it continue unrestricted. Then the Leaden Key do a terrorist attack to derail the whole thing because they really, really want animancy suppressed. The White March expansions are all about this too. Andra wants to keep the secrets of the White Forge hidden from the rest of the world, and this is so important to her that she sends the Eyeless to wipe out everyone who knows about it, even though she doesn't have full control over them and can't call them off. You convince Andra that the cat is out of the bag, and knowledge of the Forge is so widespread that the Eyeless would kill the entire Deerwood to succeed in their mission, drawing the attention of everyone in the world. Some secrets cannot be kept forever, and efforts to do so may do little more than draw enough attention to cause exposure. It takes effort to suppress the truth, after all, and that effort can be noticed. But then the Eyeless decide to restore the once-killed god Abidan to his true form as god of preservation, and you get 3 choices. Allow them to do so, even if it causes conflict. Destroy them and leave Abidan in his current diminished life, which validates Andra. Or argue that he should be restored, but with some of his memories left out to temper his instinct of preservation. To do so, you have to argue that sometimes some knowledge must be kept secret, and the game seems to treat this as the best ending because it results in peace and prosperity. It's an odd moment because it seems to conflict with the rest of the game's ethos, generally in favor of knowledge. And in RPGs, it's typical for the most peaceful ending to be the golden ending, the one indicated by the game to be the thematically favored outcome. But here, refusing to hide parts of the truth from Abidan, refusing to argue in favor of suppression of knowledge, results in the most tumultuous ending. Even completely refusing to repair Abidan, giving Andra total victory and inspiring her to use floods to destroy even more knowledge, ends up also inspiring the people you've helped to realize that the real secret of the White Forge was the friends we made along the way, and, to quote the ending slide, prosperity brought peace to the border region as Deerwoodens and Red Sarens alike left old quarrels behind. Perhaps with these endings, the White March indicates that seeking truth in all cases will inevitably cause conflict, and sticking to your morals means accepting this fact. A valuable lesson. It might go down easier if you could attempt to make arguments to temper Abidan that relied more on past knowledge helping us learn from mistakes, like you can argue to Maneha. Instead, the only way to get this ending is to make arguments in favor of secrets and selective knowledge that would fit right in the mouth of Theos Ix Arcanon. Even if the Eyeless would reject the argument that Abidan should learn from his memories to change, it would be nice to be able to make it. I was similarly disappointed that the only way a high IQ watcher can challenge Andra's philosophy is by arguing that suffering always and innately strengthens the soul, instead of getting different arguments for different dispositions all unlocked by the intellect ability check. I suppose that's the risk Obsidian took making a game about such complicated ideas that frequently presents options that are actually morally ambiguous as opposed to help refugees or murder them. Sometimes a game still fails to present an option that might seem logical to the player, which can make the consequences from the choices more frustrating than interesting. But setting all that aside, it is true that exposing an inflammatory truth can and will set things on fire. It makes sense that an untempered Abidan creates conflict when he's reminded that Andra killed his mortal body to stop him from preserving the Ingwithans. Maybe it's meant to complicate the rest of the game's treatment of truth rather than contradict it. I don't think it succeeds so well this time. The 3 main themes of Pillars of Eternity intertwine when you reach the finale and discover the secret that Theos and the Leaden Key, and even Andra in her own way, tried so hard to keep buried.
That the gods aren't real.
They are not the all-powerful creators of the world. They are high-end animancy constructs, created by the Ingwithans sacrificing their own souls en masse when they discovered that there were no quote-unquote real gods. They felt that Kith on their own were incapable of living morally without a higher power, So, the Ingwithans crafted gods to embody their society's own core concepts, and these creations are indeed powerful. Perhaps there is no practical difference between them and real gods. You can say as much, but they still represent a lie. They still represent the notion that people cannot handle the truth that there is no grander purpose to the universe, that ordinary folk are not capable of living on their own. This is the ultimate example of the past influencing the present. The choice by Ingwithans generations ago has created immortal entities that still hold power over the modern world. The efforts of the god Aothis to rebel against his peers resulted in the Saints' War. It is speculated in Durance's side quest that the Saints' War was actually an attempt by Aothis to stop the Hollowborn crisis before it could happen. The Hollowborn themselves are a result of Theos stealing infant souls to empower the goddess Woedica, the member of the pantheon most agreeable to the Leaden Key's goals and methods as the goddess of law and authority. And who is Theos? A man who has been blessed by Woedica to always reincarnate as the same man, and always awaken to the entirety of his past lives upon reaching maturity. He is basically the one person in the world who does not just reincarnate, he respawns, carrying his memories of the otherwise extinct people into the present day, tirelessly manipulating the rest of the world out of the belief that spreading the truth of the god's creation would mean the sacrifice of his kind would all be for nothing. He is the past of Aora, the exerted will of a long-dead people stifling the progress of Kith in the present. And if not for the protagonists, he would continue to do so forever like an inverted Sisyphus trying to push learning back down every time it grows. He lives a tormented existence but has hardened himself, numbed himself, so he can inflict torment on others. You only see Theos' perspective after he dies. You see a vision of a group of Ingwithans being sacrificed, leaving Theos alone. Then you can choose what to do with his soul. Will you simply allow him to reincarnate again as normal? Let him reincarnate after wiping his memories to give him a fresh start? Destroy his soul? Trap his ghost to live imprisoned forever? I consider this a more successful decision point than the end of the White March, in part because you get more options. You can even choose whether you destroy his soul compassionately or vengefully, but also perhaps because you never get an ending slide tipping the scales towards a right or wrong answer here. It's all up to you, to how you've internalized the game's themes and how you feel this situation compares with similar ones. What Theos and the Ingwithans did will never be undone. The past should not be buried, it should be learned from. But does that mean that wiping Theos' memories is a bad thing? Is it possible for memories to be a burden? Trauma too painful to actually learn anything from? Is Andra sometimes right? I find erasing Theos' memories a more compelling prospect than curating Abidan's because Theos is using his memories for malevolent conspiratorial ends, while Abidan was the victim of the other gods' attempts to bury all that remains of the Ingwithans. It would be a fresh start for Theos, but a compromise for a currently diminished Abidan. Maybe you disagree, and you may have very good reasons for doing so. Maybe you went through the whole journey coming to find that humans need the gods, that Theos may have been right. The game is nuanced, and we interact with its themes through many angles. Baldur's Gate 3 is a story about authority.
Authority.
What does it have to say about authority?
Authority.
Abuse of authority is bad, don't do it. And that's pretty much it. Okay, fine, that's super unfair. While its central theme is somewhat simplistic, it does a good job presenting different flavors of abusive authority. Enver Gortash is deceptive, sowing fear and paranoia to paint himself as a strongman savior. Raphael and Auntie Ethel use opportunistic coercion, taking advantage of people in desperate situations they can convince into technically consenting to their deals. Ketheric Thorm uses direct force and violence, as do his lieutenants and minions. The Emperor takes the Gortash approach, demonstrating what it's like to be on the receiving end of such manipulation from someone you're not quite as predisposed to opposing. Vlaakith and Shar embody the end result of long-term indoctrination and worship, the end goal that Gortash wishes to achieve for himself. He would turn himself into a makeshift god king just like Vlaakith, in imitation of someone like Shar. Orin just likes killing people. She attracts followers who also like killing people. From what we see of her initiation process, it's entirely possible that the ballists who help her are people who just want to be there, making Orin the least tyrannical villain in the game. Congrats, Orin, our non-problematic queen. The most in-depth look into power we get is the manipulation of the Emperor, who is compellingly written as an abusive friend. He insists on his unique usefulness to you, claiming he is the only one who can help you and you must do everything he says. If you argue with him, reject him, he turns hateful and threatens you. If you stay on his good side, he'll be perfectly nice, but he wants you to do things his way and not indicate any divergence from his plans. He consistently downplays your own capabilities if you resist putting worms in your brain. And because his goals genuinely do align with yours, unless you insist on one choice at the very end, it's entirely possible for some players to never realize how sinister he really is. He can survive the game, go his own way with a friendly handshake and wave, and likely do a lot more harm to others as he rebuilds his criminal empire. He may be the scariest villain in the game for this, from a certain perspective. Gortash gets some exploration as well when we visit the city of Baldur's Gate. We're told that he's using Fear of the Absolute's army as a false flag to accumulate political power and be named Extra Super Special Archduke by the now second most powerful Grand Duke. We see his coronation, encounter propagandists in the street, and we hear a few NPCs idly discuss their thoughts on him. Interestingly, though his steel watch are a constant presence in the city, they do not seem to be interfering with the everyday lives of the citizens. The market square and taverns are lively, people go about their business as normal, oblivious to the possibility that Gortash's tyranny will spring on them once he cements control. It's subtle, maybe not even intentional, but a nevertheless true-to-life depiction of the ways authoritarians make themselves palatable while laying the groundwork for more absolute control. When you return to the coronation chamber and see the slaughtered nobles, you see what the Steel Watch can do to the unsuspecting citizenry at a moment's notice. The main characters never seem to engage with these ideas themselves or express any opinions about this beyond "this sure is bad." It's not a particularly in-depth examination of Gortash's authority, it is rather a presentation of it for the sake of throwing an obstacle at the player. There's a side quest where we have to deal with his control over the city's newspaper, but only to make sure a smear campaign about the party specifically doesn't get printed. It may be direct and grabbing, you don't want something bad to happen to you after all, but it doesn't really delve into how this kind of propaganda works. To be fair, this is realistic for how many people approach problems that have political causes. If an average person has a conflict with their landlord, they're not going to start yelling about the intricacies of the renter's economy, not unless they're a Twitter addict. They're just going to express this specific problem with this specific landlord. It's naturalistic to just have the authoritarian villains there and the protagonists treating them as nothing more than obstacles to be opposed. We don't always need main characters who can insert themselves into animancy debates to propose and justify public policy ideas. The best part of Baldur's Gate 3 is Act 2, and that is partly because all of a sudden the entire game coalesces around a theme that is only present for this act. That theme is the impact of grief. A shadow curse has spread across the land by the power of Shar, the Lady of Loss, wielded once by Ketheric Thorm. Thorm's entire motivation is grief for his dead wife and daughter, and his turn to villainy is all an attempt to forget his grief, and then, eventually, to bring his daughter back to life. The curse was unleashed by Ketheric the first time he died, in battle against Selûnites, before he left Shar for Myrkul. It's an expression of his refusal to let go, his hateful and vindictive inability to accept loss, process grief, and it has twisted the land, corrupted Ketheric's children? Family? Whatever these other Thorms are, whom he never cared about as much as his daughter Isabel. When someone allows grief to consume them, they can radiate its destructive effects onto others. The grief is not exclusive to the act's main villain. Isabel mourns the version of her father she once knew. If you help rescue the tieflings in Act 1, the canon choice, don't argue with me, then roughly a third of them are murdered in the shadow-cursed lands before you get there, with many survivors being captured. As the remaining tieflings recover in the Last Light Inn, they are racked with survivor's guilt. They wish things went differently, they wish they were taken instead. Maul makes a deal with the devil to ensure the safety of her gang in the face of such horrors. They are desperate, traumatized, grieving. And because you've gotten to know many of the dead in Act 1, you may be grieving too. At least as much as you grieve any fictional side characters. If you screw up the frankly obnoxious fight when Marcus sends demons to kidnap Isabel, you're faced with the death of everybody at the inn, nearly all the remaining tieflings and the Harpers as well. It's okay to save scum that fight. I give you permission. You're welcome. When you succeed in fending off the kidnappers, you can begin to turn things around. Become a beacon of hope as you bring relief to the mourners, help Halsin heal the land, and loosen the choking grip of grief. It's one of the best experiences in RPGs. Of course, this is only a third of the whole game, and because of the game's freedom of approach, it's entirely possible to have a far less impactful experience. I think the intended and best experience is this. Travel with Karnas. Betray him to the Harpers and grab his lantern. Go with the Harpers to Last Light. Meet Isabel and defeat Marcus. Then crawl through Rythwind Town, slowly learning more of Ketheric's story through environmental details, and encounter his unique relatives before infiltrating Moonrise Towers and finally meeting Thorm in the undead flesh. Everything clicks in that order of events. Of course, it's not a bad thing that the game lets you step out of this ideal order, and if you're playing evil, then you obviously make everything worse for the characters and likely leave the curse over the land forever. Selfishness and violence is not the way out of grief. A shame Ketheric never learned that. Act 2 is the part that most rivals the tight storytelling of Pillars. There is one other recurring theme in the game that I don't really know what to do with. It's not like Pillars where the different perspectives on the theme flesh it out and enhance it. Instead, it feels contradictory and a little troubling. That theme is nature versus nurture. This largely shows up in relation to mind flayers and whether or not they have a soulless, manipulative nature that can be overcome. It starts as soon as Lae'zel gives you the rundown on your tadpole problem and expresses her hatred of the Geik. The Githyanki broke free from slavery and helped demolish the Illithid Empire, so Lae'zel hates mind flayers on a fundamental level. But, you know, she's brainwashed at this point, so what does she know? Later in Act 1, you meet Omelum, a friendly mind flayer who has broken free from all Elder Brain control and has joined the Society of Brilliance. So this seems to set up a particular rule. Mind flayers are all part of a specific hive mind, an elder brain, but if one can break free, it can choose its own path and be independent. The deceptive, evil nature of mind flayers is actually the imposed nurture of a more powerful intelligence that can mind control its subjects. In that way, mind flayers are basically equivalent to vampire spawn, like Astarion and his fellow thralls, who are moral and normal once Cazador is dead, as long as Astarion doesn't sacrifice them all to ascend. But when you discover that your dream visitor is a mind flayer, the Emperor, this gets murky. He consistently justifies his initial deceptive appearance by saying that trickery is just in his nature as a mind flayer. It's how he does things.
Illusion is my language, just as words and actions are yours.
Then he'll ramble about how superior Illithids are and how much cooler you'd be if you became one. It is completely justified to be suspicious of him. He's a super shady guy who lies and hides things from you.
I never lied to you. It is true that I withheld reality. I showed Orpheus and his guards as evil beings. I never lied to you.
But I find it frustrating that on several occasions the only dialogue options you get to outright challenge him boil down to, ew, gross squid. You can't claim that this it's in my nature thing is just an excuse, you have to buy into it. The idea of mind flayers being bad by nature is reinforced if you make Karlach one. She maintains her personality, but in the patched-in epilogue, it seems to be fading. Even with her free will, her spirit is becoming muted. Perhaps the same thing happened to the Emperor after he stopped being Balduran, though we never see normal Balduran to compare. So all in all, it seems that mind flayers really are inherently bad by nature, and Omelum just happened to help out. I've seen an interesting theory on the game's subreddit that mind flayers have their personalities influenced by the brains they feed on. The Emperor did his best to feed on criminals, people who he thought wouldn't be missed in an attempt at ethical brain chomping, and ended up turning into a manipulative crime lord himself. It's an interesting idea. It adds a layer of tragedy to the Emperor and complicates the idea that Illithids are evil by nature. But it's not a fact of the species mentioned in the game, so those who don't theorize about this are still left with the more essentialistic impression. There's also the matter of Shadowheart, whose mind was constantly wiped by Shar, but her good-hearted nature just kept poking through, expressed through her friendship with Nocturne, her empathy for the Tiefling refugees, and deep regret if you help slaughter them, and her disapproval of a bad player's random cruelty. While her quest never mentions the concept of nature versus nurture by name, it clearly fits in with the theme, because no matter what nurture the Mother Superior attempted to impose, she could not crush Shadowheart's good nature. Then, of course, there's the side quest where you can steal a Githyanki egg and hand it over to the Society of Brilliance. I say steal, but it's completely possible to ask the guy overseeing the eggs politely and convince him to give you the one that isn't hatching so it won't be destroyed for being weak. Orpheus still considers that stealing, but who cares what he thinks?
Orpheus drinking a 40 in a death basket.
The Society wants the egg for an experiment. Is it possible for a Githyanki to be raised to not be a violent space fascist? Are they inherently evil, or can they be taught to be civilized? Obviously, the Society is being very racist about this, but the egg is set to be destroyed, so what's the harm in giving it a new home? Well, it turns out that the Society members make the Githyanki, who they name Petaris, age to maturity super fast and then torture him because that's a great way to teach morals. The Githyanki snaps and murders everyone in the building by the time you can get there in Act 3. And if you confront him, and if he can't be convinced that the code of ethics the Society raised him under is wrong, he will attack. The arrogant Society nurtured Petaris into being just as violent as they theorized his nature was. But one could, perhaps, draw the conclusion that Petaris turned the code of ethics more violent than his instructors expected because he was a Githyanki, because his nature was wrong. I doubt this was the intention, but there isn't really anything in the game to eliminate this as a possibility, which means we have yet another muddled instance of nature versus nurture regarding whether one of these fictional D&D species is innately bad. Dungeons & Dragons has had a fraught relationship with alignment for decades, especially the racial alignment system. If all orcs or goblins are aligned chaotic evil, then there's no guilt mass killing them for XP because they are cosmically designated the enemies for the players. But there's also very little storytelling potential for them. Treating these groups as monolithic evil hordes makes them generic and boring, which means the only roles they can play are various forms of fodder for the fleshed-out villains, instead of having anything to explore themselves. It's also, a little evocative of really bad real-world ideas to have an inherently evil race of brutes in your setting, let alone, 10. It makes the logic of real-world bigotries an objective, rule-codified fact of this fantasy setting. Reflection and recognition of this is what spurred more recent editions of D&D and other tabletop games to abandon inherent racial alignments. It's interesting that this modern licensed D&D video game would bring up the nature versus nurture conflict head-on, but it isn't explored deeply, and I think the game fumbles it pretty badly. It basically keeps showing scenarios which imply that there are inherently bad types of people, while stating that there might be mitigating caveats. All the game would need to counterbalance this would be quests that explore the idea of nature versus nurture from other approaches. If there were more characters like Omelum instead of just Omelum.
I was born with a propensity for arcane magic my people despise. It gave me the strength to resist the Elder Brain.
Just as Grieving Mother, Maneha, Abidan, and Theos present different approaches to the question, is it okay to wipe your memories of past misdeeds, there could be characters who represent more of a nurture-first approach to this theme. I wouldn't be thinking so much about this if the game didn't bring it up, if the Society of Brilliance didn't use the phrase nature versus nurture directly, if the Emperor didn't try to defend his lies by saying, I'm a mind flayer, it's just what we do, if your refutations of him weren't so often limited to can't trust any mind flayer ever for any reason. I feel like Larian kinda whiffed it on this one. But luckily, it's not the main point of the game, it's just the weakest link in a long narrative chain. To pivot to a much more positive element of Baldur's Gate 3's story, the progression of the Tiefling refugees throughout the game, on a non-evil playthrough of course, results in a supporting cast of NPCs that I imagine most players really grew to care for. In the Pillars White March expansions, Obsidian missed an opportunity to try something similar with the village of Stalwart because the village gets almost completely sidelined in Part 2, and there are no other groups of NPCs that really have a chance to progress over time. The tieflings in Baldur's show up in every act, and your actions are responsible for giving them happy resolutions. You save them from goblins and the druids, you keep them protected at last light and free the kidnapped ones from Moonrise Towers, and then you can see them in the city of Baldur's Gate itself. Some are waiting for a chance to enter, while others, like Alfira and Lacrissa, are already making new lives for themselves. There are other NPCs who you see across the game as well, like Barkus Root, or Isabel and Dame Aelin. While big, sprawling RPGs put the player in contact with many different innocents in need of help, most of the time you move on from wherever they are and you never see them again. Even if you make a profound difference in their lives, they can simply fade away in your memory. But these major NPCs in Baldur's stick with you, physically and emotionally, as the tangible impact you have on their lives develops before your eyes. It's how companions often progress, applied to far more people. It's something that happens in BioWare's series like Mass Effect, but this time condensed into a single installment. Larian has tried this sort of thing before in Divinity Original Sin 2, but to much less success, at least in my opinion. It furthers the heroic fantasy of a good playthrough, and drives home the emptiness of any subsequent evil one when you know what should be waiting for you on the rooftop of the Elfsong Tavern, but isn't, because this time you chose to abuse authority at the expense of others. Wow, that sure was a lot of things I said. Why did I say any of it? Well, Baldur's Gate 3 is a momentous occasion in the history of RPGs. It is one of the most successful games of the genre, and it achieved that without dumbing down RPG mechanics, any more than purists may say D&D 5th edition already did. For many, this game is the new standard, and that's kind of a problem. Just a few months after Baldur's Gate 3 released, Owlcat released their latest RPG, Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader. It's made in the same mold as Owlcat's Pathfinder games, with a similar presentational style and level of voice acting to Pillars. Key lines will be voiced, there's a lot of reading, conversation perspectives are in the same top-down view as gameplay, all that stuff. I haven't played Rogue Trader myself. It is, after all, ill-advised to play a big RPG before at least a few patches to iron out all the bugs and add extra content. But I did look at its Steam reviews and saw a disheartening number of people expressing the sentiment that after Baldur's Gate 3, a game like Rogue Trader is just hard to get into, or even bad. Also shortly after release, an indie game dev made a series of tweets discussing how much of a miracle Baldur's Gate 3 is in terms of being able to even get made, and cautioned gamers at large against expecting the same thing to happen frequently. Smaller studios do not have the resources necessary to pull off full voice acting, fully mocapped conversations, high-level graphics, and the like. Big studios, meanwhile, are usually run to be extremely risk-averse and homogenized while imposing unreasonable deadlines and crunching their developers to hell and back. Because a lot of gamers are morons, the narrative became lazy devs are upset that Baldur's Gate 3 is good and now gamers want more good games. But I was reminded of the GDC talk Josh Sawyer gave about Pillars of Eternity 2, and how the development of that game was thrown into disarray when they felt pressured by the success of Larian's previous game, Divinity Original Sin 2, to suddenly add full voice acting halfway through the process. They also felt pressured to reduce the party size, thus reducing party composition and banter opportunities, which I at least see as a loss. The addition of full voice acting ballooned the budget, and a lot of people on the team were unprepared to actually incorporate it. Sawyer spoke about this again in a recent interview with Rock Paper Shotgun. To quote the interview, "With Pillars of Eternity 2, we were in a position where we knew that we did not have enough time, 9 months before we hit that wall," Sawyer says. "We raised concerns to management, and the options were either to invest more time in it or to cut scope and staff. And they didn't want to do that. The problems were compounded when Sawyer was blocked from cutting a major feature, and when, midway through development, Obsidian committed to voicing every character in the game. It was that feeling of accelerating towards a brick wall, Sawyer says. We knew that it was happening, and the closer we got to it, the more stressful it became. I and a lot of other people on the team became really harsh and were snapping at people. I didn't really recognize myself at a certain point because I had very little tolerance for time being wasted and questions and things like that. I was pushing people in a way I had never done on a game before. Pillars 2 is a great game in its own right and turned a profit eventually, but at its initial launch it was considered a failure. It would be foolish to attribute all of this to these divinity-chasing development decisions, but it would be equally foolish to disregard them as sabotaging factors. I hope people who played and loved Baldur's Gate 3 will look back and give some of these other CRPGs a chance. But I also know that a lot of them never will, because it took the expensive, flashy presentation of Baldur's Gate 3 to convince them to give it a look. Playing Pillars of Eternity after Baldur's Gate 3 is a mixed experience. It means marveling at how far the genre has come, but also lamenting good ideas that seem to have been left behind. It means appreciating great writing and feeling frustration at the comparatively less interactable world. It means falling in love with unique characters, but realizing that there is a lot more that could be done to truly get to know them. I hope Larian's masterpiece can serve as an on-ramp for plenty of people to explore these less presentational gems of the genre. It does a lot of things right, but there are other ways in which it is surpassed. Baldur's Gate 3 feels like a Dungeons & Dragons campaign in a way no other video game has managed, by effectively simulating the ingenuity and flexibility that players can bring to the game's rule set and world. It also feels like a D&D game in that it simulates a dungeon master throwing a bunch of ideas at the players, some of which are exciting and nicely varied, and some of which are surface level or underbaked. Pillars of Eternity, on the other hand, feels like literature. It's cohesive, interesting, philosophical, and sometimes it's overwrought or just not fun. There's room in my heart for both.